Ladies and gentlemen, the session will now begin. Please take your seats.
The growing tensions that culminated in the war in Ukraine and the Sino-American rivalry put NATO and the dialectic of the transatlantic alliance back at the forefront of global affairs. The 2022 strategic concept falls within this dynamic. It confirms the intentions of strengthening the capabilities of NATO for the benefit of the defense and collective security of all the allies. The wider Atlantic cannot be reduced to a vast and simple space, segmented between the Euro-Atlantic and the South Atlantic. It must also be thought of as a relevant space for cooperative security and economic prosperity. What is the South Atlantic's room for maneuver? What are the intentions of the Atlantic Alliance? What are the consequences of the global powers play on the region? Are there opportunities for cooperation in the wider Atlantic?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our moderator of this session, international TV presenter and journalist, Ali Aslan.
Thank you. Thank you so much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. For those who were here for the session on inflation, which I had the pleasure of moderating yesterday, obviously that was a tough one. But in general, if we're looking at it, all the major issues are being touched upon, and it's a wonderful agenda from inflation to climate change to many aspects of life and geopolitical concerns that are affecting us on a daily basis. But of course, it's nothing without security. If there's no security, then obviously everything else is being put in at the back front. Therefore, I am delighted to be moderating and hosting this very timely, very pertinent session titled NATO, the South Atlantic, and the Global Strategic Balance, ladies and gentlemen. I couldn't have asked for a better, more wonderful, more experienced panel that our hosts have assembled for me here. Up first, she's the Minister of Defense of Portugal. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Minister Helena Carreiras. Great to have you. Great to have you. Please have a seat. Minister, I'm not going to ask you how it feels to be back in Morocco after the loss, but that's a different, that's a different issue.
Okay.
Wonderful to have with us the former Spanish Foreign Minister, Ana Palacio, ladies and gentlemen, is here. It's great to have you. Welcome. Please have a seat. He's the military advisor at the UN Department of Peace Operations based in Senegal. Biram Diop, ladies and gentlemen.
New York. Based in New York. I'm actually in New York, my friend.
New York, Senegal,
Yeah.
We're all a global community here. Wonderful to have you with us. It's not going to change anything about what you're going to say and your expertise here on this panel, needless to say. And last but certainly not least, he's the Deputy Director of the Foundation for Strategic Research, Bruno Tatre, ladies and gentlemen.
Anna, it's okay.
Welcome. Let's dive right into it. Minister, lots to talk about. And obviously, this session aims to look at security from a much wider angle, not Eurocentric. But I think even at times like these, even in Marrakesh, even in Morocco, we cannot start a session on NATO without touching upon the war in Ukraine that is affecting so many lives. It is being said, and the conventional notion is that this war in Ukraine has, in a sense, reinvigorated NATO and the transatlantic alliance. It has given new sense and purpose to it. Would you concur?
Oh, of course. I can testify to the great unity and cohesion, added cohesion that has been built after the invasion of Ukraine. One of the aims of Mr. Putin to divide the Western allies, NATO and the EU, has provoked exactly the opposite. We are united, we are cohesive, and we are sustaining Ukraine against this illegal, brutal invasion. It's, in fact, something that we have to start with, the acknowledgement that we are facing a brutal invasion, that the laws of peace and the laws of war have been violated. The international law and the laws of war, the basic acquisitions of civilization that we had already, such as we should not attack civilians, we should not endanger and brutalize the weakest in society. We are witnessing this. And so there is a lot to stand for. There is a lot to unite us for defending the sovereignty of states, the ability of states to defend the right to exist, in territorial integrity, self-determination. These are the values that unite us. And that's, of course, something we should cherish and try to preserve, because, of course, there are divisions. But this is a capital that we need to stick
and
to.
Unity, obviously, more needed than ever. Ana Palacio, Spain, of course, is a very important member of NATO, a long-time member. Would you agree? Do you see that unity within the alliance?
Please allow me, although we are short of time and time is very valuable in this type of conferences, I would like to start with some words in Spanish. Words of gratitude. I would like to express my gratitude to this event, to this conference that has always been on the ground and has always taken into account the Atlantic region. It is always a great pleasure to be in Morocco, in Marrakesh, and at the Mamounia. That is always such a paradise.
Fantastic. And what I would enlarge a bit the focus. Yes, NATO has got a raison d'être, and we know that at a certain moment NATO was deemed brain dead. And this is an expression that was used, but the truth of the matter is that it was questioned if you see the first drafts for the strategic concept of Madrid before the invasion of Russia, there were gender and other very mainstream issues, but not a clear focus. So that's clear. But I would like to bring another perspective. Ukraine is focused, but we have to address the moving of the center of gravity. We see today the center of gravity of interest that until now it was more economic interest, geoeconomic interest, shifting to the east. Now it has gone to the north and to the east, also in terms of security. I think we need to keep NATO 360, and I'm sure that we will be able to discuss this. Why? Because there is another perspective here, is that NATO, yes, is concentrated on Russia, but we have for the first time in the concept the climate change. And because we have to know that behind all this crisis there is the energy issue. And the energy issue brings me to this idea of unity that you were saying, where we have Sweden and Finland joining NATO. And this will bring me to the last issue on this shifting of focus north and east, is the Arctic. From the South Atlantic, or from this Atlantic, Mediterranean, African, Latin American world, we have to take into account what it means, not just in terms of climate change, that the Arctic is open, in terms of what I say, shifting the focus, shifting the center of gravity, and how we will react. One last comment in terms of security is that the Arctic Council used to be composed by Russia plus 2 non-NATO members, Finland and Sweden, and the rest were NATO members, we know Canada, etc., etc. Now everybody is a NATO member except Russia. The Arctic Council is something that we have to pay attention also from our perspective. The Arctic concerns us.
Thank you so much. And whether Finland and Sweden will eventually join, of course, NATO depends a bit on whether Turkey will remove its objections. Up until now, it is still threatening its veto. Biram, I'm going to come to you in a second to sort of widen the debate, but I do want to give Bruno a chance to respond to what Ana Palacio was saying, because the person, of course, who said that NATO is brain dead was none other than the French president, Emmanuel Macron, back then. Would you say even he has changed his mind these days?
Oh, he's a very stubborn person. He rarely changes his mind. I mean, he's a very interesting character. But let me get back to what you said. He didn't say NATO is brain dead. He said NATO was running the risk of becoming brain dead. But the important thing is he was not referring to the military organization. He was referring to the alliance. And the alliance for him was about the trust that one could have between European countries, the United States and Turkey. And that was a comment that was deliberately focusing on a particular situation, which was northern Syria. There was a breach of trust, in particular between Washington and Paris, but also between Paris and Ankara. So these tensions, interestingly, even though there is unity in NATO, they're still there. They're still there because even though Turkey is a faithful NATO member, no doubt about that, it takes positions from time to time which are slightly different from those of most other NATO members. So behind the unity, there are still possible tensions. Ukraine is certainly bringing NATO back to its core business. It didn't need a raison d'être. It already had it. It's always been the same. Collective defense of the East. It has always been its raison d'être. And there is a risk that because of this new focus on NATO's original mission, then NATO gets less preoccupied about what's happening south of it. And certainly the situation in Northern Africa, the Sahel, Africa, the Middle East, and the periphery, so of course, it's the periphery only if you see yourself at the center. But what NATO sees as its periphery will remain as important in the future because geography is geography. And that's the reason why the strategic concept of NATO actually says there is Russia, but there is also terrorism as a potential security threat for NATO that we all share. But there is a risk that in terms of political attention, in terms of security partnerships, in terms of budgetary efforts, NATO becomes so focused on Russia for good reasons that it tends to forget that there's a whole world out there and that the economic and political interdependence of our regions as such that we should not, and we cannot actually lose our focus to the southeast and southwest of Europe.
Indeed, Biram, we've listened to voices from Portugal, Spain, and France commenting first and foremost about the war in Ukraine, of course, where we in Europe, I'm based in Berlin, Germany, where we are mostly affected, but also the US and the international community, of course, for that matter. You are a military advisor at the UN Department of Peace Operations in New York. Before we spread out the discussion, give us a sense of the war in Ukraine right now, from where you're standing, from the international community's perspective, and also the US, if you will, because you are, at the end of the day, based in New York.
Thank you very much. Let me, first of all, thank all the organizers for inviting us and for giving us this opportunity to discuss very important issues. Let me also congratulate all my colleagues who are working in the humanitarian pillar and also in the political pillar and who are already intervening in the Ukrainian crisis without too much noise and without being always known. So I need to recognize the wonderful work they're doing. I am the head of the military affairs, the Office of the Military Affairs. And my institution is responsible of being aware of what is going on, planning accordingly and generating the capabilities we need. But before doing that, we need to have a mandate. It's based on the mandate and its objectives, and based on the situational awareness that we plan and we generate capabilities. Here, we are facing a very difficult situation, whereby we are not able to have a mandate. Because as you know, in the Security Council, we have 5 permanent members. 3 of them do not generally have too much difficulties to agree because they believe generally in the same values. And 2 others, at the best case scenario, are together. So in the best case scenario, you have 2 poles, one of liberal democracies and the others. In the worst case scenario, you have 3 poles. How to find the compromise that is needed to come up with a satisfactory mandate? This is the challenge. And currently, it's not even possible to undertake the discussion because one of the permanent members is a belligerent and has the veto power. So we're almost hopeless. We're almost in a situation where there's nothing we can do. But we are anticipating for in case by extraordinary, we are able to have an agreement because the belligerent came to a better understanding, better collaboration with the others that can lead to the vote of a mandate and a resolution. That's where we are now. A lot of frustration, but who knows? One day we can have the surprise, so we are anticipating. But please, peacekeeping is not only about those who are in uniform. You have the military pillar, the police pillar, but you also have the humanitarian pillar and the political pillar. These 2 last pillars are actually making things happen in the field. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Minister, if we're looking at this, certainly from where we are in Europe, our time is predominantly occupied by talking about the war in Ukraine for obvious reasons. But of course, there are many other conflicts taking place at the same time, sadly, all around the world. You're looking at Yemen, you're looking at Mali, you're looking at Ethiopia. Many of those conflicts don't get the necessary attention in the so-called Western world and media. What is the recipe here? What is the solution? Do we have to, America is probably a good place to plead for that, to have a much more open and wider perspective of what security actually means, not just for us Europeans, but the wider sphere and geopolitical aspects.
Oh, definitely. I think you asked for the recipe. It's not easy, and there are no previous recipes for the complex conflicts we are facing. But definitely the idea of having this 360-degree approach and trying to advance what has already been settled in documents, such as the new NATO strategic concept or the European Union compass, that we should be enhancing the cooperative security of our spaces, and the partnerships are one way to look at it, because we are interdependent in terms of security. NATO has always had as its one of its core tasks cooperative security. It's true that right now, of course, due to what's happening in the eastern flank, we are focusing on deterrence and defense regarding Ukraine. People talk about a Ukraine drain effect. And Bruno has already mentioned the risk that we forget these other areas, these other sources of potential threats that we're facing. But I believe that the documents have it there. The NATO strategic concept sets the importance of cooperative security, of partnerships strongly. Portugal, and we're talking always, as we were discussing before, from our circumstance, from our place. And I'm proud to say that my country has always underlined the need to look at the South, to have this wider vision of security threats and responses. Because actually the war in Ukraine has shown that there are problems that also affect the South, coming from the situation we're living, food security, energy crisis, etc. So this interdependence becomes even more evident. So we need to focus on the importance of partnerships, of establishing partnerships, creating grounds to develop effective solutions and political dialogue and common knowledge to help us face threats which are really common, from terrorism to trafficking, and to the links of both to organized crime that are affecting all our societies in the South and the North. And this is just not a statement. This is something that we know it's true, and so it's really important that we don't forget this, and there should be everybody reminding the need to strengthen these partnerships for our common security. So I think this is one of the ways to look at it. We've been promoting this. Portugal has been active, as you know, establishing an Atlantic Center where political dialogue, where knowledge building, capacity building are promoted. But it's not only about what we should do within these partnerships, is how we should do it. And definitely there are things we can improve there. We need to communicate better. We need to listen to others. We need to co-create this security environment. And this is something we can still work on, and requires maybe a renewed attitude regarding Southern partners.
A new attitude, Ana Palacio, is needed, says Minister Carreras. A closer look at the opportunities and the potential for cooperation in the South Atlantic, in the wider Atlantic. Do you think that all these conflicts that are taking place at the same time, that whether we want it or not, we are impacted by it, whether it's in Libya, it's in Mali, it's in Yemen, it's all around the world, it's not just Ukraine. Do you think that the European/Western political elite is coming to realize that everything is linked with one another? Do you see a shift? You've been someone who's been in power as foreign minister, talking to your colleagues. Do you think this 360 perspective is now?
Well, unfortunately, what I see, and I have been recently in different trips in the Baltics, in the north, and first, they are convinced. It's publics, addressing publics is the defense minister of Latvia, addressing the German defense minister. And by the way, I'm paraphrasing now, but I was quoting Macron. Macron said, what we are currently experiencing is the brain death of NATO. The Economist, November 19. Now I'm paraphrasing publics. He was addressing like this, the German defense minister. He said, we don't know if we can trust you. We are ready to die for NATO, for democracy, for our principles. Are you? I mean, this condensates the idea that is in the Baltics, and I would say in the East, with Poland playing a different role, a very important role in their idea that they will have an army that will be the most powerful army in the European Union. I will come back to that. But what I see is that there is a great commitment and a very convincement attitude in the north, in the Baltics, in the Nordic, in the East, where they see the West is back. I mean, honestly, the West is back. You say it in the Southern European Union countries, it's not that clear how the West is back. The West is back. The East is in trouble. The South is divided. We stand by democracy. We stand by principles. We are here. We are ready to die. And this brings me to a different idea. First, it's not just terrorism in the Sahel. It's Wagner. Wagner is the low-cost Russian army. It's Wagner. We are, and Morocco knows it very well, as the military exercises that they have been conducting are beyond the idea of terrorism. It's security in a much more classical sense as well. It's hybrid. It's all this complexity. But there is also another idea that we have to address. It's okay, NATO is NATO. Now, what about the European Union? Are we going to act together? Are we going to overcome having 17, I'm not exact, maybe there are 18, 17 different aircrafts and 180 different weapons. Not just, systems, all this. Are we going to come together and take our responsibility? Because, again, there is a neighborhood approach to that the Europeans have to come to terms with. And I must say that France has done it. In Mali. Mali, it was France by itself, not the European Union, which places us against the need to get our act together, having a better coordination within the European Union is not contrary to NATO. And this is what we falsely have been saying. NATO is an alternative to the European defense. Not at all. What I think is that we have to come clear, invest. The Germans, that you know well, have pledged 100 billion. Well, I hope that we see this 100 billion, and that we see this 100 billion with, I'm very critical with this idea of just autonomy and European autonomy, but I think that we should understand that the first thing is an industry, is the defense, the European defense industry. We cannot have this fragmented defense industry. So my response to this, there are many angles to the question. Of course, the UN and General Job will give us, and there all the European countries are, but there is a dimension, which is European Union, that we have to come to terms with.
Yeah, a European Union, of course, that is not always seeing eye to eye. It is putting on a unified front these days with 27 member states, but we do know, including Hungary, some countries are not necessarily abiding and subscribing to the notion that the European Union right now is acting in unity when it comes to Europe. NATO, of course, Biram, is a transatlantic alliance first and foremost. Do you think from where you're sitting and looking at the globe and the many perspective conflicts that we're seeing right now, do you think it should evolve into something bigger than that, something beyond that? Is there a blueprint in your mind that NATO could evolve into something bigger, or do you think it will always, first and foremost, be a transatlantic alliance?
I will not take this risk. I don't know. I don't know if NATO should evolve, should change, should adapt. But before coming to NATO, I can talk about it later, but I would like to mention one issue we should not forget about. Currently, our securities are intrinsically linked. With the butterfly effect, whatever happens in point A will affect point B. And if we want to have, since yesterday we have been talking about multilateralism, cooperation, but this will not be possible if we are not sure that there is the minimum security in all the players within this wider Atlantic. And what I am seeing now is that in South Atlantic, at least in the eastern side, meaning the African coastal countries, if my memory is good, say around 21. Most of them have suffered from coup d'etat. Most of them, or many of them, have also benefited from peacekeeping missions, which means that they are suffering from a security fragility. And something needs to be done for them to be good partners to the rest of the wider Atlantic, at least in the security domain. First, at the national level, I think countries in this side of the Atlantic need, in an autonomous way, to themselves define what they understand by security. What are their security priorities? One should not accept for those who are coming outside of this region to define those security priorities. They need to do it themselves. What are we suffering from? Once you define this, then you have the conditions for you to go ahead and develop the security institutions you need to tackle those security priorities. And then you have to conceptualize the way you would like to tackle your security priorities. This is not being done. This set of initiatives, definition of security priorities, creation of security organizations adapted to the priorities, and conceptualization of the way you would like to tackle your security issue. That's at the national level. Now, they all should also take into consideration the necessity to work at the regional level, because the securities are intrinsically linked. How can we make sure that our regional organizations are more effective in promoting security within our own regions? This needs to be done, and if needed, define regional security strategies that will set the framework within which we want to cooperate. It's extremely important. In many African countries, it is not done, and it is very difficult to practice something you have not put in theory. This is a very big security gap in most of these countries that are in the eastern side of South Atlantic. And these countries need also to look across the Atlantic, namely in Brazil, in Argentina, in Uruguay, and see how they can learn from their experiences, how they can create avenues of collaboration and make sure that the security will improve. Now they need also to look north and see what is happening there in the North Atlantic and learn from them. And if you want, I can take the floor later and elaborate more on the cooperation and all the impact that this cooperation can bring to the African countries that are in South Atlantic.
We will certainly hear more from you in just a moment as we do the rounds. I'm also going to bring in the audience in just a moment. But Bruno, let me ask you, and this may be peculiar to ask a Frenchman, ask you about the Americans here for a second, because at the end of the day, they seem to be on a somewhat unilateral pathway for quite some time. America first, withdrawing from international affairs, increasingly the Syria war, certainly for many years, a prime example of that. Now they seem to be back in the game, due, perhaps first and foremost, due to the war in Ukraine. Is this something that has shown to the Europeans / the West that at the end of the day, as much as we talk about autonomous, strategic autonomous defense and security in Europe, America, at the heart of it, is still the indispensable nation? Without the US, the security aspect cannot be guaranteed, in this part of the world at least.
Sure. Before I do that, let me quickly answer two of your questions. One, will NATO become global? The answer is no. No and no. For 4 reasons. One, because there is no consensus on it. But that's not even the most important reason. The second reason is the treaty. The treaty, you cannot find an agreement to modify the treaty anyway, even if we wanted to. 3, we have enough on our plate. Russia is back, unfortunately, in a bad way, So that's enough for one alliance. And finally, the US is not interested anyway. The US does not want NATO to expand to Asia. So for these 4 reasons, NATO will not become a global alliance. Let me just add a very quick word about the interconnection of conflicts and why, from most Westerners' point of view, Ukraine is special. Ukraine is not just another conflict. Ukraine is special because it has global ramification on 4 different levels. Level 1, power. It involves a UN Security Council permanent member, one which is also a nuclear power, and a big one with that. Number 2, it has broken a fundamental norm. It's not only a country attacking another one, it's a country that wants to erase one of its neighbors from the map. It's as simple as that. One which had, Russia had recognized the territorial integrity, the borders of Ukraine. Let me remind you. So it's not a stretch to make a parallel with Iraq and Kuwait, for instance. It's not that much of a stretch. So, third reason, it has global implications, and that's obvious, unfortunately, including in this part of the world, for goods, for the availability and price of goods. I mean, I'm sorry, but Mali is an important conflict. The French know about it, but it's less important for the world overall than Ukraine, because Mali does not produce as many goods that go on the global trade as Ukraine and Russia do. And finally, it also has implications precisely because of the Sahel that Anna reminded us of the presence of Wagner. Well, if Russia, as it probably will, starts decreasing its Wagner and other militias presence in Africa, what will it mean for the stability of these regimes, etc., etc.? For these 4 reasons, I mean, I'm very comfortable to say that Ukraine is different, and the whole world should care more about Ukraine than it should care about other conflicts, which are very important for the countries themselves and the regions anyway. In answer to your question, what was your question? I'm going to answer. I know the answer, but what was the question?
It's about the... I pretend that you, as a Frenchman,
I get it.
deliberately forgot about the US, but...
it's totally okay to ask a French about the Americans. We love talking about America. So. But let me tell you 2 things. One, there is a French narrative about the United States, which is a very consistent one since the late 50s. America is leaving Europe. We cannot count forever on the protection of a distant, big country. It's not that we don't like it. We love America. We do. But you cannot count on it forever. Now, that narrative, which is very consensual in France, happens to be excessive, I think, because for all the talk about America withdrawing, America reducing, America not caring, America is still there. America has proven that it can be quickly back en masse if needed, if Europe needs it. So I think that pervasive French narrative is a bit exaggerated. At the same time, there's a kernel of truth in it, because you talk to the US armed forces in Europe that have been deployed provisionally for the support and reassurance of our Central and Eastern European friends. They say, hey, we need to go back to Asia now. They literally tell you that it's a problem for their training, because what they really care about is China and Taiwan. So I think the French narrative has a kernel of truth. It is true that America does not want to be as present militarily and security-wise in Europe as it was during the Cold War, because now it has a bigger priority. At the same time, it is also true that America has proven that when we need it, it's there. So that tension is very difficult to reconcile. It's permanent tension. Has been going on since the 50s. You need to pay more for your defense, but you also need to buy more American. We're okay to pay more for our defense, but we would like to pay a little bit more European. No, that's not okay. Well, that's okay for us. Well, if you don't do it, then maybe what? Maybe we will be less present? Oh, come on, you've always been there. That's the kind of dialogue we've been having with our American friends since literally 1949.
And a debate and a conversation that is set to continue despite maybe some isolationist tendencies that still exist, particularly within the Republican Party. I'm going to come to you now and collect some questions. And before I do, Minister, just perhaps one quick last word before we get the audience involved. NATO is very careful about making sure that about the rhetoric and the argument that NATO is not at war with Russia. It is Ukraine that is at war with Russia. Obviously, Ukraine not being a NATO member, Article 5 does not apply here. We had, of course, the short-lived incident in Poland with the missiles where people thought maybe now they're dragging a NATO member into it. And of course, the nuclear aspect that everybody is so concerned about. At what point do you think NATO, which of course very much is aiding and arming Ukraine and assisting Ukraine, at which point do you think that line of argument is becoming obsolete, redundant, and, if you will, artificial, that NATO is not at war with Russia? It's something that, of course, for good reason, the transatlantic alliance wants to avoid.
Well, of course, there are many, many good reasons to avoid that. And I believe that NATO will stick to this, even though admitting that the allies are helping in many different ways. Under the Ramstein group, for instance, under the lead of the Americans, but also at other levels, Ukraine. And this effort needs to be strengthened, in fact. And so this is clear among NATO. I believe that it's still very important to keep that red line to avoid further escalation. And it's something that NATO really has to do, and I believe it will be done as such, because otherwise we will be contributing to something even worse, and I believe there are still many possibilities to tackle this conflict and support Ukraine without allowing for this further escalation. Yes.
Certainly, further escalation is in nobody's interest at this particular point. Let's bring in some questions. I know we have also emerging leaders here in the room, and I want to hear from them. The microphones, do we have microphones come up? I already see a number of hands. I want to bring you all in, time permitting, but I need you to be a team player and be as precise as possible with the questions. Can we start here with the... Please introduce yourself quickly, state your question. We're going to combine the questions, by the way. It's not going to be one-on-one, so I'm going to come back to you and give you an opportunity to respond to those questions which you feel are relevant to your particular and specific field. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name's Christina Cowett. I'm a policy analyst with the Government of Canada, specifically with the Department of Natural Resources, and I work on liquid natural gas. So you can imagine my file's been busy since the Russian invasion. My question is, how can countries achieve energy security while forwarding climate commitments, since both are essential?
Thank you so much. Please pass on the mic to the gentleman behind you. I'm making the rounds from right to left. I'm coming to you.
My name is Amit. I'm the director of the NTU SPF Center for African Studies in Singapore. Singapore is working, and ASEAN partners work very closely on a common security architecture where they have both adversaries, China and the United States, sit in a common room, the Shangri-La Dialogue, and have an open and candid discussion. Is there a space now for Morocco, particularly, to take that kind of an initiative where Russians and the Europeans and the Americans could come and talk freely? It's better to have tough talking, hot air in a forum like this than draw your guns. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Can we have here in the first row? I'm coming from my perspective right to left, so don't worry about it. That way I make sure I don't forget anyone. Go ahead.
Thanks. My name is Pablo Medina from Mexico. My question is, how do you deal with the asymmetry of Russia's hybrid warfare, right? Whether it's Wagner involvement or blowing the Nord Stream pipeline or flying drones around. It's a hard one, right? But how do you play it with a pragmatic standpoint rather than an idealist standpoint, right? And I think that Russia sometimes plays with a different mindset, so that would be my question.
Thank you so much. So, we've covered this ground. Yes, please. And then making our way over.
Thank you. Suha Çubukçuoğlu from Istanbul, Turkey. I think one of the elephants in the room is Turkey's precarious situation within NATO. And listening and reading the media in Turkey, there is a rising concern that with the U.S. pivot away or heavily leaning towards Greece, that de facto borders, NATO's borders, are now passing through the Aegean rather than through eastern or southern Turkey. I want to ask the speaker's opinion on this, and especially Turkish President Erdogan's close flirt, let's say, with President Putin of Russia, and his stated intention for Turkey to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, how would that fly with NATO? Are these two things compatible? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, making our way, exactly, going this way and then coming down here.
Richard Danziger from the UK, working on migration and security. One of the speakers mentioned how much more important the issue, the conflict in Ukraine is than that of Mali. I'd be curious to hear from other panelists, because I would say that's a very short-term view of looking at things. And the potential of insecurity reaching out to Europe and beyond from what's going on in the Sahel remains enormous, and we shouldn't be blind to it.
Thank you so much. Yes, please go ahead and then hand over the mic.
Thanks very much. Michael Stopford. I joined this 10 minutes late, so I hope you didn't already cover this, but 10 years ago I ran NATO's strategic communications in Brussels. And we were, at that time, working quite closely with Russia, rather unexpectedly, including on areas of sort of suicide, bombing, terrorist prevention, etc. And I just would like to comment on one thing here with this view about the war at the moment. The Cato Institute in Washington, which I'm sure you know as a fairly conservative institute, put out a paper a few months ago saying it was entirely predictable that NATO expansion would ultimately lead to a tragic, perhaps violent breach of relations with Moscow. Of course, we have the defense minister, foreign ministers here, and it would be very interesting to know what they think about that. And I would say that, again, I don't know if you've talked about this already, but President Macron's interesting comment about a new security architecture, including some kind of security guarantees for Russia, would seem to me, speaking very personally here, that's a very promising avenue to discuss. And I'd love to hear what people say about that.
Thank you so much. We actually covered all that within the first 10 minutes. No, I'm just kidding. This is, no, good question. Of course, the question, what, if anything, what blame NATO has to bear here, if at all, is of course one that I will address to the audience. Yes, yes, all of you in that corner.
Yeah, okay.
I see a very diligent.
I will leave the microphone on this square, right?
Please.
Okay. Professor Nadia Moti from Mohammed V University in Rabat. I can 100% agree with the General Diop when he said that peacekeeping is not only a matter of military, but it's also humanitarian and politics. And as a Lombard citizen, each time I'm reading the news and each time we hear this, probably the Third World War, etc. So for us, it's an alarming decision, knowing that there is also the military industry that has its also lobby. So we really want to hear from not an expert point of view, but we want to have your...
Thank you. My question, we had been hearing for last 1 hour, Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. We understand it is your priority today. I want to ask a question to both Minister of Defense of Portugal and Ana Palacio. I see that today the Mediterranean, which is a very important strategic zone for you, is absent from your strategies and from your priorities. The Madrid strategic concept, adopted only a few months ago, had made a very mild reference to the Mediterranean dialogue. Unfortunately, we have been working with you for a long time, and we have here about 4 or 5 ministers, Foreign Affairs, Ben Isa, Moratinos, yourself, Ana Palacio, where we're attending all this Med dialogue. It was a 1-hour meeting every year, and you're not sharing with us anything. The second question for you too also is the coherence in your policy as far as the region. And as far as Europe, I see that the policy of Europe was absent. The security of the European Union policy, it was absent in your debate. What kind of coherence do you seek? Because I know you're all Europeans. Of course, the alliance is something wider, but where is the instrument of the European Union in this context? So I think that what is important is how you think your countries of the Mediterranean, Spain, Portugal, and so on, Italy, should enhance the Med dialogue within NATO.
Thank you so much. I think we have 2 more questions here, if I count correctly, and then we're going to throw it back to the panel. A very wide variety of questions here. I'm very much looking forward to the answers.
Professor Yasmin Hasnawi from the American University in Kuwait. My question is for the Minister of Defense. Many have been celebrating the unity of the NATO and the West since February 2022. When you compare that to the pull-out from Afghanistan or the military intervention in Syria and Libya, the question is, why did it take an invasion on the European continent to bring about such a unity? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And the final question goes to, yes. Yes, indeed.
Hi, my name is Astana. I'm the ambassador of Malaysia in Morocco. My question is, why does NATO refuse to die? Or more accurately, why does NATO refuse to die?
Refuse to die?
Refuse to die. Or more accurately, why do some of its members refuse to bury NATO, even as its raison d'etre had been met more than 2 decades ago? My suggestion is, as the need for the organization that was set up has been met, bury it, and then create new ones as new needs and challenges arise. Simply because when your only or your main tool in the toolbox is a hammer, every problem is going to look like a nail. And my suggestion is, that is what we have today. So that's my question. Secondly, on Mr. Tetre's element about the US not being interested to expand NATO, and on your 4th point about the expansion that it's simply not interested, I think that's a little bit not true, because early in the 60s, the US did try to set up a kind of NATO in my region of the world, Southeast Asia, and that was the SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. But it was an absolute flop, simply because countries in my region absolutely refused. Why? Because it was anathema to our culture, to our values. The countries in our region generally do not believe in confrontation. We believe in cooperation. And within years of the US trying to set up SEATO, countries in our region got together and set up ASEAN on a completely different kind of mode, which is cooperation in all things. And to that, I agree with the gentleman on the other side of the room about the possibility of Morocco playing a role and bringing these countries together for discussion. Thank you
so much. You promised it's going to be a very short one, 30 seconds. 30 seconds.
First, isn't NATO...
If you start with first, we're going to be in trouble.
Very, very, very
short. 30 seconds, not first.
You lost already 15. Yeah. Isn't NATO afraid that by supplying arms, you're pushing Russia to use nuclear weapons? Number one. Number two, who is going to lead the peaceful negotiations if Russia does not accept Guterres, our dear beloved Secretary General, as a mediator in this regard? Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Quite a wide variety of questions here, many, many aspects. Please don't feel obliged to answer all of them, otherwise we're going to miss lunch. But certainly some of them were directed to you personally, and some are pertaining to your field in particular. Minister, I don't know, why does NATO refuse to die? It's an interesting one, but please go ahead and...
Okay. Why would NATO want to die? That's the question. NATO has always evolved through crisis, and that also addresses some other questions. NATO is a defensive alliance. It should remain so. I also think it should not, and is not probably willing to go global, of course. It has an open door policy. Some countries want to become members. And that has been the case. So I believe that, of course, there's a lot of responsibility in that NATO members should have regarding the effects of alliance policies in the world and its relation with partners and other actors. But definitely, it's a guarantee of security for my country. It is the major guarantee of security for all its members. It is a common decision. And it has evolved through crisis. And right now, it was in a crisis, not so much at the military level, It works very well, but at the political level, yes, it's being overcome. It does not mean that there is no dissent or divisions. There are. There have always been. So we should not expect that everybody has the same position. But it has had the ability to overcome this crisis and shows this strength and providing security to its members. That's what NATO is about and should be about. And so I don't think it should die. I think it should evaluate its actions responsibly, as it has, I suppose, in the world, and see itself as a regional alliance that has to establish bridges with the rest of the world, with its partners. And I think the questions on the attention to other parts of the world, to the Mediterranean, for instance, are very interesting because, in fact, the dilemmas, the security challenges we're facing in the Sahel, in other parts of Africa, in the Southern Atlantic are challenges that we have to see as global themselves and affecting us all. So we should bear in mind that there is this context to NATO action, and that would be my answer to this these questions regarding NATO. I would tackle also the question on regarding the asymmetry of Wagner and Pablo's question on what to do. Strategic communication is something that we have to enhance. I believe that it's important to explain, to clarify, as someone was saying before, what are our reasons to want to build common ground. And we're talking about common ground with our partnerships. It's not to have the same positions. We're talking about creating the conditions for sharing knowledge, which is essential to face these common challenges, to face Wagner, to face other type of non-state actors, to face terrorism. We have to create conditions to have an open global economy, to prevent violent conflict and war. This is a bit back to the basics, but yes, it's still possible to do it, and this alliance has a role in this.
Thank you so much, Minister. Ana Palacio, which questions do you want to answer?
I will just telegraphically answer two, because I think that the answers have been given before. On Asia and this idea of cooperation. Yes, you're absolutely right, and General Diop highlighted it. In Latin America and in Africa, there is a fragmentation, not just in this area of security, but all over. And this is a must. And ASEAN is a fantastic project. And by the way, I think that the blueprint or the inspiration could well be the European Union, the European construction. So we are on this in agreement. On this idea of establishing a dialogue, well, it takes two to tango, but I think it's a good idea to explore. Maybe it's not right now, the moment is not ripe, but absolutely yes, we have to pull the attraction to this wider Atlantic basin, including Latin America, including Africa, including the Mediterranean. I will go to the ambassador's question on the Mediterranean. Okay, yeah, well, you can...
Ambassador, your question is being answered.
My question. So, you are right. The European Union had a priority on enlargement. And shall I remind, because you were there, the Barcelona process. The Barcelona process is what tries to to fix the attention of the European Union on the Mediterranean. Well, after the enlargement and after the TACIS, the FARE, there was an unbalance on the efforts of the European Union vis-à-vis the southern border of the Mediterranean and the eastern border, whatever this eastern border has been. So before the fifth enlargement and after the fifth enlargement. You're absolutely right. And this is a common endeavor, and it's not an easy one now, because as I said, we have to be realistic. The focus of attention has gone north and east, and this is a reality that we have to tackle. Key country there, France, absolutely yes. Now, I would like to respond to the question about that our Mexican friend asked. Part of this question is the same, is there need to be more cooperation. Even Mercosur is not that, I mean, it's difficult. We have a responsibility, and we have our own, if you allow me, I mean, it's big brushstrokes, petty interests of the European Union that are just not having this bilateral agreement with Mercosur. But having said that, in Latin America, we have an issue of fragmentation. But you said about the hybrid war. And the hybrid war in Latin America, the first thing you see is RT, is Russia Today. Russia Today is the household TV in many households in Bolivia, in Peru, all over. And this is a big part of the hybrid war. Part of the hybrid war is also the participation in all kind of unclear operations against democracy in all this, in all these countries, and we know what is the origin. And I will go. I mean, it was clear in Catalonia. It was clear in the Gilets jaunes. It is clear as well in Latin America. One thing that we tend to forget is that it's also the security cooperation that is very specific and very targeted from Russia to certain just governments in Latin America, to name just one, Venezuela. So, I mean, I take a sentence from yesterday. Latin America countries have to take responsibility, the same way that African countries have to take responsibility. But we have a common interest there, and we need to accept this common interest. My last issue. One thing that we haven't said about the United States is that for the first time, we have a great narrative that came from the United States on the war in Ukraine. And this just allow me, the UK gentleman, that by the way, your review of security strategy and all that was focused exclusively on the Indo-Pacific. So I'm happy that the others, we have to concentrate on other targets. But the truth of the matter is that on all this, either we have a very realistic, and realistic is not saying we are poking, NATO pokes the Russian bear. It's not true. I mean, there is no justification for what Russia has done. And by the way, Putin's calculation was that it would be a free ride. It hasn't been. So if we mean what we say, then let's just put our acts where our words are.
Thank you so much. To obviously very, very important points that you raised here throughout your answer. I obviously going to bring in Biram Diop and Bruno Tetres as well. Diam, please go. Which questions, Biram, did you hear that you want to prioritize in answering?
First of all, I would like to concur with my brother from Singapore and say that, yes, Morocco can play a very important role in almost all domains, given the geographical position of the country. Morocco is part of the center of gravity of the world, and as such, can serve as a bridge between the different parts of the world. And the good news is that, based on what I know, Moroccan authorities understand that very well, and they're playing the role they have to play to bridge all the different parts of the world. Yes, totally. Morocco can facilitate the dialogue in all domains between all stakeholders. Now, coming to NATO, I will tell my sister who was talking about the death of NATO, I'm not in favor of the death of NATO, because I strongly believe in collective approach, in the fact that many heads are always better than one. If countries accept to get together and try to work on their collective security and their collective defense, it's a wonderful step forward. It means that these countries that belong to the same institution at least are not in a dynamic of confronting each other, which is good, which participates in promoting peace. Now we need to understand that human beings' endeavors are never perfect and will never be. So NATO will never be perfect. And we need to criticize NATO for NATO to improve, but not for NATO to disappear. Because in the meantime, while we are criticizing NATO because we are not happy about some of the activities or the result of NATO, there are a lot of good things NATO is capable to do. So let us be tolerant, let us be patient, because we are lacking of that now, and try to support this collective effort that is being made by NATO member states. They will do their part today. The generation that is in charge of NATO will do its part today and will transmit it to the next generation. But it will never be perfect. Collective security needs to be dealt with in a very collective manner. And NATO has decided to operate under the UN Charter. We need to remember that. So NATO is very supportive to what the UN, which is representing the international community, is doing on behalf of all of us. So it is also important to remember that NATO, beyond the sphere of member states of NATO, is also trying to impact what is going on within the entire world, accepting to operate under the UN Charter. I was in NATO not a long time ago, and I can tell you that NATO is supporting very effectively the UN in many regards, in the training, in the capacitation of our units that are being deployed, in women, peace and security, in fighting against terrorism, disaster relief, and so on and so on. But unfortunately, those achievements are not very often known by the public. So if I have a recommendation to give to NATO, is to communicate more strategically so that what they are doing is known by the public. Now, I will finish with the ranking of conflict. I think we should not rank the conflict. I am coming from Mali, and if you tell Malian populations who are suffering very badly on a daily basis from this long-lasting crisis, that the Ukrainian war is more important, they will not agree. If you talk to the Ukrainians about the fact that the Malian crisis is more important, they will not agree. So the importance of the conflict depends on who is speaking. We should not go this way. All conflicts are extremely important. All conflicts have negative impact to our world peace and stability. And as a team, in a very solidarious manner, we need to work together, hand in hand, to make sure that we face all conflict. All of them are important. We should neglect none of them.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Biram. All conflicts are important. We are in the final minutes of this panel, but of course, Bruno, I want to give you a chance, not just to respond to some of the questions that you feel are important to your specific research, but your remarks that the conflict in Ukraine is more important than the one in Mali clearly has caused some irritation here. Perhaps you want to clarify.
I don't need to clarify what I said, because what I said is on the record. It is not that Mali is more important than Ukraine. This is where my distinguished neighbor, we don't have a disagreement here. We should not rank conflict. Of course, and I believe I said it, the conflict in Mali is much more important in terms of life and death, economy, suffering for Mali than Ukraine, obviously. But in terms of global repercussions and global ramification, I stand by my comments. It's not short-termism to say that in terms of short and long-term repercussions, Ukraine, I believe, for the world at large, Ukraine is more important than Mali. It's not hierarchy of conflicts, of course not. It's ranking in global implications. Now, if you ask me, Richard, whether the Sahel is less important for the long-term future of Europe than what's happening in the East, I would say, no, it's probably as important. So here, it's a matter not of perspective, but of the qualifications, I guess. Very quickly on a couple of other points. To my Singaporean colleague, it's not a problem of finding a room to talk. There are rooms everywhere, starting with the OSCE that Russia has deliberately gutted for 15 years. There was a room in Singapore. It didn't give, many results. So it's not a matter of finding a room. There's a saying in French, on ne fait pas boire un âne qui n'a pas soif. It's a matter of two contenders interested in negotiating, which is not happening at the moment. Quickly, in Turkey and Greece, there is no such thing as a de facto Article 5 border. The Article 5 border is what it is in the treaty. It is as simple as that. There is, however, an EU border, and that EU border is between Greece and Turkey. And some countries care about that EU border, my own country in particular. SCO is okay. Talking to Putin is okay. Attacking one of your neighbors would not be okay. Quickly, now on two other points, the security guarantees RUCUS. Look, I'm on the record for criticizing very strongly my president, and I'm not known for being an adversary of my president, but on this particular point, I mean, the timing was atrocious. Talking about security guarantees now was, frankly, a bad choice. I think it's shocking for the Ukrainians to hear that Russia could get security guarantees. I mean, aren't they the ones who should get security guarantees? Remember that Russia has violated all the security guarantees it gave to Ukraine, the positive and the negative ones. So I think that my president has sometimes been better inspired. And before talking about the new security architecture for Europe, let us see where this war takes us. We used to have an architecture based on the OSCE. OSCE, OTSC, NATO, EU, that was the architecture. Again, if you look at the history of the OSCE, our collective security organization in Europe, one country in particular has deliberately gutted it. And that country was not Ukraine, it was not France. Finally, my distinguished, distinguished ambassador from South East, Seattle died. The South East Treaty is still into force. It's still considered by the UN and by the US as being into force, yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes, it is. It is into force. The organization is dead, the treaty is still there, and the last time I checked, Thailand and the Philippines are pretty happy to still have security guarantees provided by the United States.
Thank you.
I'm talking about the Bangkok Treaty. Is that clear, right? Yeah. That's the Bangkok Treaty.
Yeah. But I think the one thing is very clear, and you
the Mandela Pact.
And you pointed it out. Certainly, nobody's. There's not a prioritization or a hierarchy of conflicts here by any stretch of the imagination. I think that's become abundantly clear, so there are no misunderstandings. You're talking about the global ramifications, and at the risk of, the ambassador said, all I've heard was Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. I hope that's not true. I hope we were able to broaden the scope here within the past 75 minutes. But, Minister, we have 60 seconds left. We did start with Ukraine, and at the risk of beating a dead horse, allow me to end with Ukraine. How and when is this going to finish? A very easy answer, very easy question.
When we understand that there is no abstract peace, that peace will only be possible if we acknowledge the circumstances of war. And these are very clear. There is an invader, and before we are in a condition, in a position to negotiate, the invader has got to go and create the conditions for talking about possible concessions, but not before. We need to acquire the space for building peace.
Ladies and gentlemen, NATO, the South Atlantic, and the global strategic balance. I think one thing has become abundantly clear throughout the past 75 minutes. We live in an extremely fragile world. I think that, unfortunately, is blatantly clear. It has been made clear by our four esteemed panelists. We need to be very careful going into 2023 in order to avoid the word that has been coming up here, escalation here. At this front, be that as it may cooler heads prevail. Elena Carreras, Minister Carreras, Biram Diop, Ana Palacio, and Bruno Tertre, thank you so much. This is your applause. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation this morning. We'll now break for lunch and reconvene at 2:30 p.m. Enjoy your meal.